All right, let's talk about the synoptic problem. So, this chart I find particularly helpful to just talk about what the synoptic problem is. If we think about the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if we look at the content of Mark, 76% of Mark can be found in Luke and Matthew. That's sometimes called the triple tradition, and it's based in part on that, but also on the kinds of changes that we see between Luke and Matthew in the passages where they're most like Mark, that we get the idea that Mark was written first, and that will be explored throughout the week. In addition, another 18% of Mark is taken up by Matthew, and 3% more of Mark is taken up only by Luke, but not Matthew. Now, Mark doesn't have very much that isn't taken up by somebody, but Luke does. Luke has 35% of Luke's gospel that is only in Luke, and Matthew has 20% of Matthew's gospel that is only in Matthew. But this is sort of the crux of the problem if we accept Mark in priority. It's this the fact that 23% of Luke and 25% of Matthew are the same. So what happened here? And the two solutions to this that we will spend most of our time on this week is the idea that there was another gospel that we no longer have a copy of. It's scholars call it Q. Q is just the first letter of the German word Quelle, and that just means source. So they had this other source called Q that they were both using independently. The other hypothesis that we'll look at this week is the Ferrer hypothesis, and that's the idea that Matthew borrowed from Mark, and then Luke had both Mark and Matthew that Luke borrowed from. So we'll look at both of those. But the rest of this video, I'd like to show you some of the places where we see differences between the Gospels that help us to get a sense of what each gospel author was doing in the way that they told the story of Jesus, and also form the basis for the conclusions that people make about the synoptic gospels. So let's take a look at some of those. Let's start with this passage where Jesus calms the storm. And so we have Mark's version here and Matthew's version side by side. We notice a couple of differences. First of all, we see that Mark says that it was the disciples who were going to the other side, and they looked at Jesus and said, "Come on with us." Whereas for Matthew, we see that Jesus is the one who got in the boat and his disciples were following him. So we might get a sense from here, as we look across all of the Gospels, that Mark describes Jesus as sometimes more passive, whereas Matthew is concerned to show that Jesus was always in control. And we'll see that, of course, that wouldn't be proven from this one example. But when we see this repeated across his gospel, then we can come to that conclusion about Matthew. Let's look at another difference. Here we have the disciples who wake up and say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Whereas in Matthew, the disciples essentially utter a prayer, "Lord, save us because we're going to drown." And so Matthew seems to not like the disciples accusing Jesus of not caring. And instead, the disciples are more reverent towards Jesus, if we can use that. One more thing that Matthew does is that in Mark's story, we have Jesus quieting the storm and then asking the disciples about their faith. Whereas in Matthew, Jesus rebukes their faith and their fear and then gets up and calms the waves. And So we have this sense there, the difference, that the faith is highlighted in the second, in Matthew's, whereas Jesus's ability to calm the storm is perhaps highlighted there. Now, one more thing to note about this description of faith is in Mark, Jesus asks the disciples if they have no faith, whereas in Matthew, he calls them you of little faith. So, in some ways, and we'll see this in other passages as well, Matthew presents the disciples as a little less bumbling, a little less, well, frankly, stupid than Mark does. And Matthew also likes this phrase, little faith. He uses it 3 other times. He uses it in 6:30, in 14:31, and in 16:8. And one of the things that's interesting is that Luke also uses it. I don't have that on the screen, but in 12:28, um, Luke has a parallel with Matthew 6:30 that Mark doesn't have. So just to note again, as we're thinking about the synoptic problem, here we have Mark doesn't use the term little faith. Matthew uses it 4 times, and this is one of them. And Luke only uses it 1 time. And when Luke uses it, it's in a passage that has a parallel with Matthew, but has no parallel with Mark. So, as an example of a place where Matthew and Luke agree, as opposed to Mark. So let's look at Jesus walking on the water. Here we have Mark and the story of Jesus walking on the water. We have the disciples, they cry out. Jesus responds and says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Matthew says exactly the same thing. "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And then Matthew adds this story about Peter. And this is another one of those places where Matthew uses the phrase little faith. And then we have Mark ends, "They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened." We'll actually come back to that. But let's look, I have that highlighted in the next slide. Mark says that the disciples were completely amazed and hadn't understood. Whereas Matthew, again, his portrayal of the disciples is a little bit better. The disciples respond by worshiping him and calling him the Son of God. So let's look at a couple other places where Matthew softens what Mark says about the disciples. So Mark says they were completely amazed, for they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Now, this is a completely different context, but just note that Matthew, specifically in a different context, has Jesus ask the disciples if they've understood, and they say yes. So that really contradicts this idea that they were things that there were things that they didn't understand. The next 2, these are from a parallel context. Mark says, "Do you still not understand?" And Matthew specifically says, "Then they understood." And then finally, we have Mark says, "But they didn't understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it." But in Matthew, they do understand. They understand exactly what Jesus is talking about. So what all of this shows is that the disciples in Matthew are generally more sympathetic than in Mark. And we said last week that Matthew wants the reader to identify with the disciples. So that does make sense. Now, I mentioned last week that Matthew likes mountains. Let's look at a couple of those examples. Here we have Mark, and here Jesus made his disciples get in the boat and go ahead of him. And then after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Matthew keeps that mountainside. After 6 days, James and John led them up a high mountain, and he was transfigured, and Matthew keeps the mountain there. Here, the devil led him up to a high place, and Luke doesn't describe the temptations, but Luke has this high place. But Matthew has specifically a very high mountain. So Mark says that Jesus was tempted, but doesn't describe the temptation. Luke has the devil take him up to a high place, but in Matthew, the devil took him to a high mountain. Luke has Jesus deliver his sermon on a level place, and Jesus in Matthew goes up to a mountainside for what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And then Jesus took the disciples and they withdrew to a town called Bethsaida. In a place in Mark, that same place in Mark, they go to a solitary place, but this is, I believe, before the feeding of the feeding miracles. For Matthew, that's on a mountainside, but in Luke and Mark, it's not on a mountainside. Notice that the Great Commission at the end of Matthew is also on a mountain. That's unique to Matthew, so we don't have parallels to show you, but it's another place where Matthew has a mountain. Now, Matthew also seems to like earthquakes. So Mark, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And then we have the centurion. Whereas with Matthew, we have Jesus's loud cry, giving up his spirit. The curtain temple is torn. But here we have what's sometimes called the zombies in Matthew. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out, etc. And then we go right back to, like Mark, the centurion and the centurion's declaration. Mark has a furious squall that comes up when Jesus calms the storm. That passage in Matthew is often also translated as squall or tempest. The Greek in Mark says a great whirlwind of wind. So that furious squall is good English for that. Matthew says a great earthquake. Seismos is translated earthquake the other 14 times it's used in the New Testament, and it means a violent shaking. So if you're on the earth, of course, we're going to translate it as earthquake, but we can't translate it as earthquake when it's on the sea. So on the sea, we still say a furious storm, something like that. But it's important to recognize that this is the same shaking that Matthew really likes. Maybe instead of Matthew's earthquakes, I should have called it Matthew's shakings. But all these earthquakes underline Jesus's power and divinity that Matthew is emphasizing, even though other gospels don't necessarily do that. Here we have Mark. Jesus enters Jerusalem and goes into the temple. He looks around. But when Jesus enters Jerusalem in Matthew, the whole city was stirred. And this is the verb that has the same root as seismos. So it's the whole city was shaken. It's that same idea, and asks, who is this? In 1614, we have the Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, are going to anoint Jesus, and they're on the way to the tombs, and they wonder who's going to roll the stone away. And in Matthew, on the way to the tomb, there's a violent earthquake. Now, I want to look at that passage in a little bit more detail, because when they get there, not only is there no earthquake, but we simply find out that the stone had been rolled away, and Mark doesn't bother to explain what happened. Matthew really likes clarification, and so Matthew not only describes an earthquake, but he explains what happened to the stone. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now, if you remember in the Gospel of Peter, the story gets even more elaborated. But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it 2 by 2 in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven. And they saw that the heavens were opened, and that 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and come near the sepulchre. But that stone, which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off the side. And the sepulchre opened, and both the young men entered. And so those soldiers, having seen, awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were present, safeguarding. And while they were relating what they had seen, again, they see three males who have come out from the sepulchre, with the two supporting the other one, and a cross following them, and the head of the two reaching unto heaven, but that of the one being led out by a hand by them going beyond the heavens. And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, Have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep? And an obeisance was heard from the cross, Yes. So let's look at what Matthew does with the law. Mark says, On hearing this, Jesus said to them, It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners. And Matthew says, It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Those words are from Hosea 6:6. Here we have Mark telling the story of Jesus, and Jesus is telling the story of David going in and eating the consecrated bread. Notice, just as a note, that Mark puts this in the days of Abiathar. That's not actually correct. In the Old Testament, it's a different high priest. That's not the name of the high priest. Matthew corrects him and doesn't give a name for the high priest. But again, he adds this phrase, If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And so we find that the teacher of Israel uses love to interpret the law. Matthew is emphasizing that here. And that quote I just gave you, the teacher of Israel uses love to interpret the law. That's from Burridge's book, The Four Gospels, One Jesus, a symbolic reading. So here we have some more about Matthew and the law. The teachers of the law asked Jesus, of all the commandments, which is the most important? And ultimately, Jesus praises him. You are not far from the kingdom of God. But when Matthew tells the story, the expert in the law asks Jesus the question, but teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? The law is specifically mentioned. And here, instead of Jesus asking the teacher of the law and the teacher of the law answering, here we have the teacher of the law questioning Jesus, and Jesus answers correctly. And then Jesus ends by saying, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So it seems, and we'll see some more examples, that Matthew is concerned to really show the continuity between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. In Luke, the speakers are reversed. So in Luke, the expert in the law tests Jesus and asks what is written in the law. And actually, Luke is like Mark. The teacher tests Jesus and asks him, What must I do to inherit eternal life? That's how the whole debate starts. But then Jesus asks with this same question, what's the most important? He does use the term law, Luke does, what is written in the law. And then the expert says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, etc. And Jesus again says, you have answered correctly. But then in Luke, he comes back and says, well, who's my neighbor? And after that, Jesus goes on and gives that parable. So this is another place where we can see all of these variations to what is clearly essentially the same story. And again, this raises the question, which gospel came first and how are these stories being transmitted, whether that's orally or in written form, and how are they being redacted by the various gospel writers? Luke says, do to others as you would have them do to you. Matthew says, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Just one more example of Matthew emphasizing the law and the prophets. Now, if we talk about Matthew and Jesus's identity, in this moment when Peter answers, you are the Messiah, we have The answer in Matthew is, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. This again shows continuity of Jesus with the law and the prophets. This idea of God as the living God is repeated throughout the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy, Joshua. I'm looking at the Septuagint, the Greek version, so it's First Kingdoms, Fourth Kingdoms, a couple of Psalms, the book of Isaiah, a couple of times in Hosea, and also in Daniel. This passage in Mark, where his family wants to take charge of Jesus, and so they say he's out of his mind. We'll see that both of the other synoptic gospels really don't want to say that about Jesus. And then at the end of the story, we come back to this desire of the mother and brothers to talk to Jesus, and he ends with, whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. And then in the middle, we have this story about Beelzebub and the division of the kingdom. What Matthew does with that is he takes this, his family wanting to speak with him, gets rid of the he's out of his mind, keeps this ending, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother, and takes this whole Beelzebub story and puts it somewhere else. We'll see that Luke does something similar. The question of things that Jesus doesn't know. Mark asks the demon-possessed man, what is your name? And Matthew leaves that out. And I'm just going to show you what it is in Mark, because Matthew leaves it out, and that was taking up too much room. Mark says, who touched my clothes? When the woman with the flow of blood wants to be healed, she touches him. And Mark has Jesus say, who touched my clothes? Both Matthew and Luke take out that question. No, I'm sorry. Matthew takes it out. Luke leaves it in. Both of these. Matthew takes out this question. Matthew takes out this question. Luke leaves both of them in. Here we have at the feeding miracle, Jesus asks his disciples how many loaves you have. Both Matthew and Luke take out that question. After the transfiguration, when they come down from the mountain in Mark, Jesus asks the disciples, what are you arguing with them about? And then later asks the boy's father, how long has he been like this? Luke and Matthew both take both of these questions out. They come to Capernaum, and the disciples had been arguing on the road about who was the greatest. And Jesus asks them in Mark, what were you arguing about? In Matthew just has the disciples come directly to him to ask about who was the greatest. And we'll come back to Luke's version of this. Sometimes even these rhetorical questions get taken out in the other synoptic gospels. So the Pharisees ask about divorce, and Jesus turns it around and says, what did Moses command you? And Matthew just says, haven't you read? And ends up giving the answer in his question. When Jesus sends his disciples to get the room ready for the Passover, he tells his disciples to say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Matthew just has his disciples tell the guy, go into the city to a certain man and tell him the teacher says, my appointed time is near. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So in Matthew, Jesus takes control and says, go do this, tell him this is what happened, what is happening. In Mark, Jesus has the disciples ask, and in Luke, he also has the disciples ask. Now, just a closer look about this particular passage. He says, where's my guest room? But in Matthew, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. And in general, Jesus is more in control of his own passion in Matthew and Mark. And we see that here, where Jesus knows what's happening and he knows that the time is near. The question about Jesus not knowing things is similar to the question of Jesus asking questions. In Mark, To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? It's a rhetorical question, but even so, Matthew removes it. Luke's version doesn't mention Elijah at all. The question of Jesus having feelings. In Mark, Jesus was indignant, but in Matthew, he just reaches out his hand and cleanses him. In Mark, he's angry and deeply distressed, but in Matthew, he just heals the man. In Mark, when the disciples send the children away, he's indignant. In Matthew, he just tells them not to do that. In Mark, the questioner, Jesus looks at him and loves him. But in Matthew, he just keeps talking to him. In Matthew, in Luke, as we're going to start looking at Luke in a minute, but this is that place that I mentioned before where Mark doesn't use this word. It's one word in Greek for little faith. Mark doesn't use it at all. Matthew uses it about 4 times. And Luke uses it in this one passage that Matthew and Luke have in common that Mark doesn't have at all. So let's take a look at some of Luke's redactions. First of all, and this is again from Burridge's book, we see that one of the really important things that I believe you'll hear another scholar say during this week, but I want to emphasize it, is when I'm writing an academic paper, I might have 5 different books open on the table in front of me. And as I write, I'm going to reference this one and make a footnote, and reference this one and make a footnote, and reference this one and make a footnote. In the ancient world, they were dealing with scrolls. And so generally, you really could only have one scroll open at a time. And that helps us to understand how to think about some of these redactions. And I think Luke's redaction, you can see it clearly, where we have in this first section, the material is unique to Luke. But then in this next section, we have Mark as a source, and Mark is mixed with unique material from Luke and with material from Q. So this one is a little bit more difficult to explain. But here in this next passage, Luke just basically follows Mark. And then here, Luke is basically, if we believe Q as a source, then Luke is combining Q with Luke's own material. If not, even with the Ferrer hypothesis, Luke would be mixing Matthew with his own material. Here we have again Luke basically following Mark. Here we have again Luke basically combining Q and his own material. Here we have again Mark with Luke's own information throughout, but just Mark as a source. And finally, in the last little bit, we have some material that's unique to Luke. So except for this part, we have Luke alternating his sources, but never mixing them. I told you we'd come back to this one. We have this problematic story where Mark says that Jesus's family thinks he's crazy. Luke doesn't like that either and does the same thing that Matthew does. He takes this idea of Jesus's mother and brothers coming to see him and the recognition that my mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and put it into practice. And then the Beelzebub story is put somewhere different. Luke also doesn't like Jesus not knowing things, but about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And here Luke just goes right into the be dressed, ready for service. Mark says be on guard, alert, so different warnings, but it's the same idea. The cry of dereliction, as it's usually called, my God, why have you forsaken me, is in Mark, but Luke leaves that out. Mark also has a question when during the feeding, how many loaves do you have? I think I mentioned this when I was doing Matthew. Luke leaves that question out too. Here we have, again, I mentioned that with Matthew. Matthew takes out the question, what were you arguing about on the road? Luke does something even more. Luke says, Jesus knowing their thoughts. So Luke explicitly contradicts Mark here and says, no, 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 Jesus didn't have to ask this question. Jesus knew what they were thinking. Again, Luke has a problem with Jesus having feelings. Same one Jesus was indignant that we talked about. In Luke, Jesus just heals the man. Here, Jesus looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Luke just has Jesus heal the man. Interestingly, Luke goes on to tell us that the Pharisees watching were furious, and that's something that neither Mark nor Matthew do. So Luke is comfortable having the Pharisees be furious, but not Jesus. Here again, we have Jesus being indignant, and again, we have Luke leaving that out. Luke also likes to name people, and I used Mary as an example. Luke names Mary a lot more than any of the other Gospels, but just in general, he likes to give people names. And then Luke's Passion leaves out the anointing of Jesus, Jesus' sorrow in Gethsemane, the disciples repeatedly falling asleep. The disciples fall asleep just once in Luke. The disciples' flight, the false witnesses and the high priest at the trial, Jesus' silence, the mockery by soldiers and passersby, the amazement of Pilate. And all of this allows, as we saw when we looked at this gospel, for Luke to emphasize the themes of the disciples and prayer and women and outcasts. This list right here, by the way, is again from Burridge. All right.